Something's gone wrong inside Russia's war machine, and it's changing everything. That may be a strange thing to say given that Russian President Vladimir Putin has begun a renewed spring offensive targeting regions such as Sumy. However, that offensive hides something that Russia doesn't want the world to know. It can't win in Ukraine. Russia's armor has disappeared. Its tanks, which it needs to conduct its furious ground assaults, are disappearing, with those that remain being rendered useless. Artillery is at an all-time low, and Russia now finds itself in a position where it can't do the things it needs to do to win in Ukraine. That's what military correspondents Jonathan Lowe and David Axe revealed in pieces for the Lowdown blog and Newsweek, respectively. In the Lowdown, Lowe highlights what Russia needs to do to win the war in Ukraine. It's remarkably simple. Russia must gain more territory than it currently occupies to place enough pressure on Ukraine to force it into capitulation. Much more. Right now, Russia controls around 20% of Ukraine. That alone represents a tiny gain over more than 3 years of warfare. After Ukraine pushed back Putin's initial February 2022 invasion, Russia's forces managed to consolidate and occupy around 18% of Ukraine's territory. Since then, a tiny 2% gain is all Putin's forces have to show for a war of attrition that has cost its military over 935,000 of its people, along with more than 10,600 tanks and 22,000 armored fighting vehicles. Remember these points, they'll be important later. Russia's win condition is to, at the very minimum, claim all of Luhansk and Donetsk, according to Axe. They're the largest oblasts eastern Ukraine has, and they're still the focus of the majority of Putin's assaults. But therein lies the problem for Putin. Advances in both regions have slowed to a crawl, and Russia still needs to occupy 10 miles of territory across both to even lay a claim to full control over the oblasts. Of course, Putin has a strategy for making those advances. It's the same strategy he's had since the beginning of the war: overwhelm Ukraine with massive numbers. That's why he's poured more than 500,000 Russian and North Korean soldiers into Ukraine, alongside the thousands he's contracted from other countries. They're supposed to be the overwhelming force, an army so large that Ukraine's defenses crumble under constant human wave attacks. Those human waves aren't enough. If Russia is to advance the many miles per day it needs to take Luhansk and Donetsk, the strategy it needs to follow is simple, according to Axe. Russia launches attacks at the lightly defended rear of Ukraine's front line. Such attacks require protected mobility, meaning they're reinforced by armored vehicles, tanks, and other mechanized units. The more of these armored units Russia can bring to assaults on Ukraine's rear, the more damaging those assaults can be. Once a breakthrough is made via the protected units, Putin then relies on his superior manpower numbers to overwhelm a Ukrainian position. But there's a problem with this strategy. It's worked for the last 3 years because Putin was able to maintain his military's protected mobility. Granted, he had to do it by pulling ancient Soviet-era tanks, vehicles, and howitzers out of storage, but even those older units still offered some protection to his ground forces. Now, according to Lowe and Axe, that mechanized mobility has disappeared. Putin's rampaging assaults across multiple areas of Ukraine have resulted in a cavalcade of issues that make it impossible for Russia to win in Ukraine, and certainly not within the achievable deadlines for which the Kremlin calls. That leads us to a question: why can't Russia win in Ukraine anymore? We'll start with its mechanized forces, specifically its tanks and armored vehicles. Simply put, Russia has run out of almost all the Soviet-era stockpiles on which it's relied for the last 3 years, which has dramatically decreased the intensity of its attacks on Ukraine's rear. That's according to The Insider, which wrote in February that the latest estimates suggest that Russia is running out of military hardware. It quotes the open-source military tracker Oryx, which records all confirmed losses of military hardware in the war. According to Oryx, Russia has lost over 20,000 units of its military hardware, compared to just 7,600 losses on Ukraine's side since February 2022. Among these losses are tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers, of which Russia has confirmed total losses of over 11,600. More than 2,600 of its tanks lie in ruins, along with 1,903 of its armored personnel carriers. Infantry fighting vehicles are worst hit, 4,146 of them lay in ruins as of January 2025. And here's the most worrying thing for Putin. These are conservative numbers. Oryx only tracks 100% confirmed losses, meaning it will only record a loss if it finds video or photographic evidence of that loss. That's why its figures are so much smaller than those offered by Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, which we shared earlier. Ukraine puts the number at closer to 36,500, 3 times higher than Oryx claims. Either way, these losses are devastating for Russia's attempts to achieve victory in Ukraine. And to make matters worse, Russia's ability to replenish its supplies is faltering. Take tanks as an example. If we assume Oryx's figures are correct, Russia is losing approximately 866 of its tanks annually. Its problem is that its manufacturing facilities are only capable of building an estimated 250 T-90 tanks per year, with the insider claiming that total new tank production is no more than 300. Putin has gotten around this problem in the past by restoring Soviet-era tanks, pulling from Russia's massive stockpiles to maintain his fierce ground offensives. Now they're running out too. Newsweek reports that Russia only has enough tanks in its stockpiles to maintain its current pace of war until 2026. After that, in 2024 alone, Russia refurbished around 1,500 of its main battle tanks, along with 2,800 armored vehicles and infantry carriers. It still has several thousand of each left in its stockpiles, but it now faces a problem it didn't have when Putin first started pulling from Russia's Soviet stockpiles. It's left with the dregs. There's a logic to this thinking. When Putin first started restoring older tanks, he chose those that had survived as best as possible after spending decades in storage. Those tanks were restored with parts from other, more disheveled tanks that Russia had in storage, diminishing the stockpiles further. Now the majority of those restored tanks lie in ruins on the Ukrainian battlefield, and Russia is left with the tanks that it chose not to restore initially. Those tanks are more run down. They'll take much longer to restore and may require parts from multiple destroyed tanks to get up and running again. So you get an exponential decrease in the tank stock that Russia has available. Each replacement restored when Russia loses a tank is a little more decrepit and requires more time to make workable than the one that came before. The situation is the same for Russia's armored vehicles. For instance, Russia produces around 860 of its infantry fighting vehicles annually, about 460 BMP-3s and somewhere between 300 and 400 BTR-82s. The latter is a problem in its own right. Many of Russia's supposedly new BTR-82s are actually older vehicles that have been modernized so they're usable again. Again, the numbers don't track, even when we use more conservative Oryx numbers. Dividing 4,146 infantry fighting vehicle losses by 3 years gives us an annual churn rate of 1,385, around 500 more vehicles lost per year than Russia is capable of producing. As Russia's stockpiles of these vehicles decrease, its rate of production will slow down even further. That slowdown is inevitable. Russia only has between 41 and 52% of its pre-war reserves remaining in storage, and again, these are the dregs. The vehicles it chose not to restore the first, second, or third time around because they're in such massive states of disrepair that it will take months to make them viable, if they can be restored at all. If any more evidence of these vehicle problems were needed, we only need to look at what Russia has been doing to replace the mechanized units it needs for its increasingly faltering attacks. As of April 9th, Russia has launched a new spring offensive against Ukraine. The Kyiv Post notes that this renewed series of attacks is a turnaround from Russia's light infantry assaults, which it used during the latter stages of 2024. But there's a problem with these assaults. Where it would previously have heavily relied on tanks and armored fighting vehicles, Russia is now reduced to sending its troops to attack Ukraine with some tanks, along with motorcycles, civilian cars, and supposedly armored vehicles that are little more than converted SUVs. We saw what that altered version of Russia's strategy led to during the first week of April, when Ukraine's armed forces repelled a reinforced company-sized Russian mechanized assault south of the Chasiv Yar region. That assault included 13 of Russia's weaker armored vehicles, along with motorcycles and several civilian vehicles. That's a far cry from the massive numbers of tanks and armored vehicles Russia was bringing to its assaults on Ukraine's rear at the beginning of Putin's invasion. And it feeds into the problem that Axon Low notes. Russia doesn't have what it needs to sustain the level and quality of ground assaults it needs to occupy the rest of Luhansk and Donetsk. Without that protected force, Russia's gains slow to a crawl and the war ends up stalemating. Compounding this problem is Russia's artillery woes. Russia has a serious artillery problem. It's running out of both the artillery units it needs to fire on Ukraine's defenses and the shells that those units require. That problem has existed since at least January 2024, when David Axe reported that Russia's situation had gotten so bad that it was being forced to take artillery barrels off its older guns to keep those it already had on the front lines firing. Axe noted at the time that Russia was firing at least 10,000 artillery shells at Ukraine per day, which amounted to 5 rounds per artillery gun. Given that average firing rate, the barrels Russia was using should last for about a year. However, any of its artillery units on the more critical areas of the front lines were firing far more than 5 shells a day, accelerating the rate of deterioration for their barrels. That was a problem for Russia. It only has 2 factories with the precision machining tools and access to high-quality steel needed to produce new barrels. Those factories can't keep up with the rate of artillery barrel deterioration, which is what has forced Putin to pull barrels from other guns to keep those on the front lines firing. The outcome is logical. Those other guns losing their barrels means they can't be used when the artillery on the Ukraine war's front lines is inevitably destroyed. Putin is sacrificing his stockpiles to keep his existing artillery firing. Fast forward to 2025, and we're seeing the impact this short-sightedness has had on Russia. At the beginning of Putin's invasion, Russia had around 19,000 artillery units in storage. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance suggests that practically all of those artillery units have been destroyed. If we take more conservative Oryx figures, Russia has experienced around 2,000 losses of artillery units, including towed, self-propelled, and multiple launch rocket systems. It's here where we see the compounding effect of Putin's barrel replacements come into play. As those units are lost, they need to be replaced by artillery Russia has in its stockpiles. So those numbers are dwindling naturally. However, as Russia pulls barrels off the units it has in storage to keep those on the front lines firing, it eats into the stockpiles even more. Otherwise usable artillery units are now rotting away without barrels, and Russia's manufacturing industry can't make them usable again. This cannibalization of its own artillery means Russia doesn't have a whole lot left. The Insider says it only has 6,180 towed barrel artillery now, compared to 13,263 units when Putin's invasion started. Russia is left with 2,627 self-propelled units from a previous stock of 4,662, and around a fifth of the 1,518 multiple-launch rocket systems with which it began the war. And as with tanks and armored vehicles, the artillery left over in Russian stockpiles is the worst it has available. Those units are in poor condition, which means they require more maintenance and more frequent barrel replacements. Adding to this problem is Ukraine's intelligence strikes against Russia's ammunition stockpiles. The Kyiv Independent reported on April 9th, Ukraine's long-range drone and missile strikes on Russia's ammo depots have combined with its demolition of thousands of Russian artillery units to cut Putin's shellfire rate in half. That's according to Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's Armed Forces General Oleksandr Syrsky, who points out that Russia has gone from firing 40,000 rounds of artillery ammunition daily to 23,000 rounds. We continue to expand in this direction, increasing the number, scale, and capabilities of deep strike, and have already passed the 1,700 kilometers, about 1,050 miles, mark, Syrsky said. Our teams are also increasing the unmanned component. In other words, Russia can only expect more long-range assaults on its artillery ammunition at a time when it's also running out of artillery units, and its rate of loss is accelerating. On March 28th, Ukraine managed to destroy 122 artillery pieces in a single day, the highest one-day result it's achieved since Putin's invasion began. That tells us that not only is Russia's artillery becoming less effective and fewer in number, but what it's sending into Ukraine is increasingly vulnerable. It all adds up to a massive, potentially war-ending problem for Putin, according to Axe. The kinds of forces the Russian military traditionally depends on for swift marches deep into enemy territory are becoming an endangered species on the mine-seeded, artillery-pocked, drone-patrolled front line. And that's another good point. In addition to the already massive stockpile and manufacturing woes Russia faces on the tank, vehicle, and artillery fronts, Ukraine has used an intelligent blend of old and new strategies to take out what Putin can send to the front lines. Axe notes that Ukraine lays the ground Russia's protected units wish to travel on with dozens of mines while targeting that ground with its own artillery. Those types of tactics haven't changed much in a century, Axe notes, but they're extremely effective against a Russian advance that also hasn't evolved much since World War I. Combine these older tactics with the explosive drones Ukraine is deploying on nearly unimaginable scale, and you get a three-punch combo that's wrecking Russia's protected units. Mines disable tanks and vehicles, leaving both vulnerable to artillery strikes. With those protected units gone, Russia can't get the artillery in range of its Ukrainian targets, especially as that artillery is being targeted by Ukraine's hordes of kamikaze drones. As one military blogger put it, these defenses across the front line are so dense that Russia's mechanized units often simply don't reach the line for launching an attack. Or as Axe puts it, every Russian attack meets an avalanche of firepower in 2025. And it's that avalanche, combined with Russia's deepening equipment woes, that shows us that Putin cannot win the war. The numbers don't lie. If taking territory is the key to a Russian victory, as Axe claims, then Russia has been doing a terrible job of it in 2025. That's according to both the Institute for the Study of War and the UK's Ministry of Defence, each of which released statistics in April to show just how much Russia's advances have slowed during the year. According to ISW, Russia managed to claim just 165 square miles of Ukraine's territory in January 2025. Occupation of territory dropped to 137 square miles a month later, and declined further to 78 square miles in March. The Ministry of Defence's figures are even more damning, from claiming 126 square miles in January The ministry says Russia is now at the point where it's taking just 55 square miles of Ukraine's land per month. The rate of advance is far too slow for a Russia that needs to make rapid territorial gains to win the Ukraine war before its equipment shortages really bite down. Remember the Newsweek report that says Russia only has the stockpiles to maintain its offensives at their current level until 2026. If the March numbers don't improve dramatically over the next few months, Russia will have only claimed around 702 more square miles of Ukraine's territory by the end of 2025. It certainly won't have taken Donetsk or Luhansk in totality, as Axe claims it needs to do to stand any chance of winning the war before the stockpile issue becomes too massive for Putin to ignore. So where does that leave Russia? Well, it's launched its spring offensive. That's going as well as you might expect, given the situation we've just described. On April 14th, the War Zone, or TWZ, noted that Russia was trying to amass a force to take the Ukrainian oblast of Sumy. There are tens of thousands of troops on the oblast's border, the outlet says. But guess what they're severely lacking? Protective, mechanized units. That lack of armored firepower means that the initial stages of Russia's spring offensive have claimed practically no ground from Ukraine, says TWZ. Even in Luhansk and Donetsk, Russia has made no confirmed gains yet. That's a far cry from a similar offensive in the spring of 2024, which saw Russia's forces overrun several areas in Donetsk. What Putin has to face is that a combination of his equipment problems and Ukraine's superior tactics have weakened his advances. He's gaining practically no ground, leaving the war at a stalemate. And as he keeps pushing to try, unsuccessfully, to take more territory, he'll weaken his depleted forces even further. Who knows? Perhaps Putin is charging headlong into creating the perfect conditions for a Ukrainian counterattack that results in it reclaiming occupied territory and pushing Russia even further away from the win condition Axe says it needs to achieve. As it stands right now, Russia simply can't win in Ukraine. But what do you think about Russia's deteriorating equipment situation? Is there anything Putin can do to regain the momentum in his Ukraine invasion? Will we see Ukraine both defend its territory and reclaim some of what it's lost in 2025? Let us know in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date commentary on the Ukraine war.